Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. Just a housekeeping thing, the book that I've written is available on Amazon and maybe other places by the time the podcast is listened. I encourage you to go to Amazon and buy it. The Kindle version is live now. The paperback version will be available on the 21st of September. Some of you that have purchased the Kindle have left some reviews on Amazon. Appreciate that and encourage more to do that. I think that helps more people connect with the book. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Jack Hadley. Welcome to the podcast, Jack.
Thank you, Richard.
By way of introduction, and then I'll let Jack make sure I got most of this right. Jack is a father of a gay son, so he'll be talking as an active LDS father of a gay son who was married to his husband in July of 2020. So Jack has been on this road for about 5 years since his son Parker came out, and we'll just be talking about how to navigate this road, at least how they're doing it in their family. And we'll reference a blog that Jack has written that is very helpful, and I want more people to connect with the blog. Jack grew up in Southern California. He's in his early 60s. It's rare I have a podcast guest that's actually a year or two older than me, but Jack is, but he looks younger. He is, as I mentioned, active LDS, serves in a local calling, served a mission to Taiwan. He's spent 40 years as an entrepreneur. In that field, he's been an adjunct professor at BYU, really a social media expert. But we're not going to talk much about either of our careers, what we do professionally in this podcast. We're just going to talk about Jack's experience being a father of a gay son and some of the things that he's learned and the things that we'd like to share with our listeners. Is that okay for an introduction, Jack?
That's perfect. Thanks, Richard.
We both have kind of offered prayers throughout the day that the things that you hear from Jack on the podcast will be helpful for you. So we know this is a complicated space, and both of us are trying to do the very best job we can to talk about this, but we feel it's important to talk about it. Introduce your family to us, Jack. How many kids you have? Do you have grandkids? And where does your gay son fit into the range of kids?
So we have 5 children. Our oldest is a girl, youngest is a girl, and we have 3 boys in the middle. And Parker, my gay son, is our 3rd boy. He's 27 years old. And we have 5 or 6 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. We have twins. My oldest son, has twins on the way in a couple of months. So I think we'll be at 7 or 8 grandkids soon.
That is great. That's awesome. And twins are really exciting. So that's really exciting news at the Hadley home. Talk about, if Parker were here, he could tell his own story, but tell us about, when did Parker come out to you?
So Parker sat down with us about 4 or 5 years ago, a couple years after he returned from his missionary service in Nova Scotia, and sat down one day with my wife and me and let us know that he was gay. And I think my wife and I kind of knew before he told us that he was, but we waited for him to talk about it. So we didn't bring it up, but it's probably been 4 or 5 years ago that he talked to us about it at first.
Knowing, and this is helpful for other parents, do you have any advice for parents that suspect maybe a high school age kid is gay, lesbian, or transgender? Do you have any advice for them? It sounds like you didn't sort of out him or force the issue.
No, we didn't. And I think if I were to offer advice, it's probably to let people do that, let your children do that on their timeline. Because some are ready at certain times and some I don't think are ready at certain times. And even if you suspect that, I think my advice would be to let them initiate that discussion.
Knowing in the back of your mind that you might have a gay son, were you and your wife doing anything to sort of create a feeling of safety? Were you talking about this topic at all, or were you just, or not?
We really did not talk about it, and I don't think we were alarmed that might be a possibility. But even between my wife and I, we really didn't talk about it very often. Parker dated girls in high school, and so we didn't really know in high school. We suspected he might be in high school, but we never really thought much about it, frankly. And so we knew it would kind of work itself out, and we didn't worry about it too much, frankly.
Most parents would be pretty alarmed if they had an LGBTQ child. Why weren't you alarmed?
I don't know that we were not. You're right. We were not alarmed, but certainly, as LDS parents, you have this kind of scenario in your mind about your family and your children, and they're going to grow up and get married, and then it's all going to be as we typically think it's going to be. And so I think while we weren't alarmed, we were probably concerned just because I didn't understand what his path might be. If he were gay, what does that mean? And I think when you're a parent and you're not sure about that, and before you really spend a lot of time thinking about it, it's a scary thought just because you're not sure of what it will mean for your child. You want your child to be happy and to have all the blessings that we believe in as LDS folks. So you're a little unsure of what, if that is the case, what that means for his path. I think that was maybe the one worry that we had.
That's honest. Tell us about Parker. Tell us what he does professionally or his education background, and just introduce Parker to our listeners a little bit.
Parker is an amazingly talented, gifted, creative soul and spirit. He graduated through the ad program at BYU and is a super creative videographer. He works as a videographer now. After he got out of BYU, he got a great job at this really hot ad agency in Los Angeles. Worked there for a couple years and was kind of the envy of his peers because he got this great offer at this great agency. He found that the lifestyle in Los Angeles just didn't align with his goals and kind of with his spirit, and so he came back to Utah. But he's been working in ad agencies and in the creative field for all of his short career.
That's great. Sounds like a great young man.
He's a good kid.
And I'm glad you're close with him. Talk about when Parker came out, was there a conversation about his path forward as a gay Latter-day Saint, these different options? And did Parker have a pretty good feeling of what path he might go on, or did that come later?
I think that, as I recall, I think he was pretty clear about a couple of things. And I remember him vaguely. I don't remember the exact words he used, but I know that he said that kind of the two options that the church sort of puts out there. Well, I shouldn't say sort of. The two options that the church puts out there. One, which is celibacy, and two is entering into a heterosexual marriage anyway. That neither of those two were going to be options for him. I remember him clearly saying, "Hey, Dad, I'm not the kind of guy that can live alone for the rest of my life. I just can't do that. And it just doesn't align with my personality and my spirit. And it would be dishonest for me to even consider a heterosexual marriage." So I knew that those two were probably not going to be options. I don't know that he was clear about what his plan was, and I don't know that he knew that at the time, but I think he knew what his plan was not going to be anyway.
How do you process that as a Latter-day Saint father? You've got a son who it seems like his path then is not going to be within the teachings of our church. And maybe a follow-up question, is there anything you'd say now to yourself 5 years ago, now that you've been on this road 5 years, that you would say? Or are you kind of in the same space anyway?
I think that not being sure what his plans were going to be, that's kind of when I started educating myself better on this space that we're all in, or maybe a lot of your listeners are in. And that is that space of what does that mean for your family in terms of long-term relationships. And my wife and I really felt like that even if pursuing a same-sex relationship and maybe one day same-sex marriage, that in fact may be the healthiest thing for Parker, just for his emotional health, his physical health, his spiritual health, knowing his personality and being able to be in a trusted relationship long term. We've started to feel like that might be the very best thing for him, even though we know that puts him at odds with church doctrine or with church teachings. So I don't know that my wife and I really worried about it too much, frankly. I was more worried that if he did end up in a same-sex relationship, that it would be with somebody who maybe didn't have the background that Parker had. And especially when he was living in Los Angeles, because, I thought, well, he's probably not around a lot of LGBTQ people that grew up LDS. But when he came back from Los Angeles, he had already had a relationship with Alex, who's now his husband. And Alex is a wonderful, beautiful human being who actually grew up LDS as well. And so when my wife and I thought about him having a long-term relationship with someone who had a similar background as his, honestly, that was really comforting to us, because we felt like there's a lot better chance that they'll have a great relationship because they have similar background, and because there was a lot of trust between them. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It's really good. And I'm in a Facebook group. I think you're in the same Facebook group. It's LDS Parents with LGBTQ Kids, and one of the real discussions that happens there is, okay, my kid is dating, and I recognize this is the reality of our family situation, and I'm really worried that it's hard to do that space responsibly and hard to find the kind of person you want your child to be happy with. And it's obviously something we don't talk about at church, how to do that path. But a lot of parents have a lot of fear, and they spend a lot of time in prayer praying that their child will, if this is the reality of their path, that they'll do that path really thoughtful, and that the right person will come in their life that helps them be the person they want to be.
Yeah, I mentioned something about that in this little essay that I wrote, because I think that is a big concern. If shortly after Parker came out to me, well, not shortly after, but continually, we've had lots of discussions over the last 3 or 4 years, and people my age kind of grew up with this stereotypical idea that the LGBTQ lifestyle is full of promiscuity and, such things. And so Parker kind of confirmed to me after a couple of years after he had come out that is, in fact, kind of a big part of that world. And it just didn't align with him, with his personality and with his spirit. And so maybe that was one of the biggest fears that I had, and I kind of speak for my wife. I think she had the same fear, is that being part of that environment would be hard for him and might lead to a less than happy and fulfilled life. And so when he started seriously dating Alex, and we got to know Alex, and we knew his background and just what a sweet guy he is, and that they had all these things in common, it became it brought a lot of peace, actually, to our family, because of that. They had that type of relationship.
That's pretty thoughtful. I'm struck that Parker is talking to you, and it's a credit to you and your wife that that he is continuing to talk to you. And he probably didn't talk to you every day about everything going in his life, but it sounded like you knew enough about what was going on that he was sharing with you he was dating and who he was dating and the experiences he was having. And I just think as parents, we want our kids to feel safe to open up to us so we can help them to make the very best decisions they can, versus you could have, cut the communication off because he was pursuing a path outside the teachings of the church. But I love the way you kept the family circle together and kept the communication open. And I think that then helps Parker make better decisions. Thoughts on that, Jack?
No, I think you're exactly right. And I know probably for some of your listeners who are kind of on this road, it's hard sometimes to think about that because there's so much anxiety when it comes to the church's position and where your son or daughter is headed, and that worries you. But I think that, in my opinion, I think the Lord knows all, and He's going to make it all right. And it's just your job to keep being mom and dad, and just keep loving them, and keep talking to them, and know that some things are just out of your hands, and you just don't worry about it. You just keep loving them. And my wife and I have always had that kind of relationship with Parker, and we've felt very blessed to have it.
How have your other children responded to Parker's marriage to Alex?
They've all responded very, very lovingly. They all love Alex like crazy, and so we've been blessed to have a lot of support in our family. I know that a couple of my kids, because they have kids, they've had different dynamics in trying to kind of negotiate this space. And I understand that. I mean, when I was young and had a bunch of little kids, I'm sure I would have been thinking the same thing. Like, how do I keep loving my family and my sibling, and yet how does this align with what I'm teaching my kids if I'm trying to teach them the doctrines and teachings of the church? Like, there's so much that doesn't align in those two things. And I think my kids have done a really good job of kind of negotiating that. And there's just been a lot of love. And it's honestly because Alex is the kind of person he is, it hasn't been hard to love and accept Alex.
How do you navigate the space that you're worried about your eternal family? We talk about our families being together in the next life, and that's our dream as Latter-day Saint parents. How do you navigate Parker's eternal salvation, or where he'll be in the next life, or is our family circle in the next life? Are there going to be empty chairs? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that the empty chair story, because I seem to hear that all the time in circles that kind of talk about this road and this space. And honestly, just to be candid, I think the empty chair story should just go away. I think it's silly. I think we're worrying about things that we ought not to be worrying about. I believe, and I talk actually a lot about this in my little essay, I believe that the covenant path is an eternal path. And nothing about the timeline changes the path. In other words, just because every person who is in the church isn't on the path at the same place or taking on the same covenants and in the covenant path, doesn't mean that one day they won't, that they'll be denied those covenants. I mean, we do temple work all the time in the church for people who didn't have the opportunity to enter into all of these covenants during mortal life. And so I think, for me, I just feel like it's in the Lord's hands. And honestly, I'm not worried about the long-term, eternal nature of this whole process or of having my family together. And so I think I have more faith in that. I really believe the Lord knows what to do and that everything will work out in the end. And I only have one job in this life, and that is to love and support my son, and that everything else will work out.
I love that answer, and it simplifies parenthood. It makes it more doable. I think to control outcomes is pretty hard. Our ability to love everybody is certainly within our control. I love that, Jack. Do you ever feel like you've had to choose between the church and supporting your son? Because some people feel that, and sometimes they are made to feel that way by other members or a local leader or the culture of our church. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's really the reason I started writing this essay about a year ago, and why I worked so hard on it for so long.
Tell our listeners, we'll do it at the end, but tell our listeners right now where to get to it.
Well, it's a little hard to get to because, but if you go to my website, it's just my name, jackhadley.com. If you go there, there's a little link on the page where you can click through and read it. But the reason I really started that is because, wait, go back to what your question was.
It's just, do you feel like you ever need to choose between the church and your son, or people make you feel like that?
Yeah, so here's how I felt, and that's a really good question, because I think a lot of parents of LGBTQ children in the church probably get that question. There'll be a well-intentioned ward member or extended family member, an uncle or an aunt or someone who doesn't have any ill will at all. But they'll come to you and say, "Gosh, we heard that your son's engaged, and they're going to have a same-sex marriage coming up. Like, how you feeling about that? And I think even if it's not said in that way, I think a lot of parents probably feel like that's on people's minds, no matter how they ask it. And so that's why I felt like I needed to really get in my head my clear position on how I feel and spend the time to write that in a little essay. And so now when somebody asks me that, here's what I usually say. I usually say, I feel great about it. And if you're interested, truly interested in why I feel good about it, I've written a little something that I'd be happy to share with you that explains why I feel the way I feel. Because I think the tendency in the church would be for most members to say, well, he's just saying that because what else do you say? It's your son, and you always love your son, but obviously because he's at odds with the church, it must be a big, big deal for you. I think that's what some people think in the back of their minds. And so that's the reason I wrote this, is because to kind of reconcile how I feel with my position in being an active LDS.
Thank you for that. And when I stepped in this space, I gradually connected with some parents like you that I'd read their blogs or heard their stories, and they were the way you are. They were happy for their LGBTQ child. They're choosing a same-sex marriage. I think a lot of them didn't necessarily invite them down that path or advocate that path. They let their children sort of self-select that path. But when they ended up choosing that path, they recognized from a pragmatic perspective, I like the way you use emotional, physical, all these different parts of making a healthy human, happy human. You recognize that this path was the right path, I think. And so you were glad, and it was a day of celebration. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, very fair to say. And I like that you used the word pragmatic, because in my essay, I try to separate the discussion into two parts. There's the whole side about the biology of LGBTQ and the whole issue, are people born gay, is it learned behavior? I mean, all of that stuff is one big discussion. And frankly, it kind of bores me to talk about that because nobody really knows. I mean, science is pointing towards, very rapidly, seems to be pointing towards that people are born gay. This is not learned behavior. And so, but that whole space, it just doesn't, when you debate that space, there's no winners. It's just, so my thought is we just agree to disagree on discussion one for now. But my essay is about discussion number two, which is the pragmatic part of this. regardless of how you answer that first discussion, for a parent, I think there's only one pragmatic decision to make, and that is, regardless of what it is or how it came to be, what are you going to do now? What's the path moving forward? And I think that as LDS people, and I make this point quite often in my essay, I think that we can and should agree to agree on discussion too. Because I think there's really kind of only one, in my opinion, I think there's kind of only one option if you don't talk about discussion one and you just talk about moving ahead. And that is to love and accept and move ahead and leave the vast majority of this in the Lord's hands.
And we can all do that. Talk about one of the things that some parents of some LDS parents have that are committed to the church. They hope for changes in the church. They hope that there's a place someday for same-sex couples to participate in a greater way. And sometimes we are quick to that. If you open up with the hope of a change, sometimes that, people get really uncomfortable with that. And in my book, I've tried to use the analogy of tea and coffee as an example. There might be members that actually hope someday that we can drink tea and coffee, but they're willing to obey that and not advocate for changes. But we wouldn't disqualify them from a temple recommend or from church membership if they just hope something changes. So a lot of LDS parents have hope that, in your case, someday Parker and Alex can more fully participate in the church. Just talk about hope for change and how you navigate that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because hope is a big part of what I wrote about. And this is a very difficult discussion to have because it brings in so many related things when you're LDS. The idea in our LDS culture and in the church and growing up in the church is that, when the prophet speaks, the discussion ends. And until the prophet speaks, there really isn't discussion. And yet, I think we can see, and I don't say this to jab at the church, it just feels to me like over the decades and centuries that the church has been around, that there are kind of a lot of factors that influence change. And that's not to take away from the value of having a living prophet at all. It's more I think that change comes as people become softened and learn more, and they get more information, and do cultural norms and stuff have an effect on it? Well, yeah, they do, and I think that's okay. I don't think in any way by believing that there are more things that affect change in the church, I don't think by believing that you're necessarily saying that, the prophet's not important. The prophet brings a much needed perspective to that decision-making process, as do the other general authorities and the apostles. But I think that change, if we look at throughout history, change comes in many, many different ways. I know that there are those on the outside of the church, those who have left the church, that would say, you're crazy to think that, because they're never going to change. And certainly, if you take some of the apostles' words, the ones that kind of still really dig in their heels, you would be tempted to say, yeah, you're right. I don't think they'll ever change. But on the other hand, President Nelson is talking a lot lately about a process of restoration, that the church hasn't been completely restored, and that we're witnessing a process. So to me, that kind of gives me hope. And I'm not going to tell the brethren what to do. I'm not going to tell the Lord what to do, obviously, but to have some hope that at the very least, the discussion is more open, and whether or not that leads to change, I don't have a pitchfork and a torch, and I'm headed up to the church office building to stand outside and demand change. But I think it's okay to hope for change. And if that's the case, I think that's what will happen.
You have a wonderful style, Jack. And as I read your essay, I encourage our listeners to read your essay. I think you speak for a lot of people that are deeply committed to church, active, serving, paying tithing, that hope something changes. And I think we need to culturally create a feeling that people that feel that way, as long as they're willing to sort of follow the prophet and follow current teachings, they don't feel like second-class citizens, or they don't feel like they're not welcome, because we'll lose them. And we've lost a lot of people because they're open with hope, their hopes for possible changes down the road. And it shouldn't be a purity test to me that we all not only follow the same rules, but have the same hope about future rules as a way to create a purity test for if you're a faithful Latter-day Saint.
Yeah, and that again is a hard space, because there are certainly members on the inside of the inside. If you've ever read the work about being on the edge of the inside by Richard Rohr. It's Richard Rohr, isn't it?
And there was the first author I read was sort of I can't remember his name.
Yeah, I can't remember either. I was on the Faith Matters website, which, by the way, if you Faith Matters, I think it's faithmatters.org. Yeah. It's a great website.
They do great work.
They do great work. And I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about this idea of being on the inside of the inside and on the edge of the inside. But there are certainly members on the inside of the inside that are really, they don't want to talk about this at all. And in fact, I had the unpleasant experience one day in a leadership meeting in our ward, where one of the good brothers said, in my opinion, gay members of the church who act out love themselves more than they love God. And it's statements like that I don't know that there's a place for them in the church. I don't think, as good Christian Latter-day Saints, there's a place for that kind of thinking. And so my hope is that whether or not things change, I think we can hope for change. And what happens when you talk about faith, hope, and charity, faith is kind of a prerequisite to having hope, and hope is a prerequisite to charity. And so to develop real charity, whether it's individual charity or charity within the church as an institution, I think it has to come in part from having hope. If you have no hope, it's much more difficult to be charitable.
I love that, Jack. I love that. I love all of those words: hope, charity, faith, and your insights into how those are connected. I just recognize there's a lot of faithful Latter-day Saints. The way I frame it up, and I think my listeners may have heard this, and it's in this book, is the church's relationship with its LGBTQ members is like a 40-chapter book, and we're not in chapter 40. And so people say, well, does chapter 40 represent change in doctrine? And I say, I don't know. I say I support our current doctrine, but I sort of sometimes give examples of what chapter 40 looks like. And to me, one of the examples is that church is equally the balm of Gilead for our straight members and our gay members, and our doctrine of all alike unto God. And right now, a lot of our gay members don't have the same experience that our straight members do. And a parent doesn't have any fear when they learn their teenager's gay. Right now, most LDS parents feel a great deal of fear about their future in this life and the next life. And to me, that fear is gone in chapter 40. So I just think we've got work to do. And I think most Latter-day Saints would agree we have work to do. We're not at chapter 40. It just feels like an area that, and so the experiences of parents and the blog you've written, to me, just help develop more empathy and more charity to things you're teaching. people are hard to hate, close up, move in. And the front of your blog's got a picture of Parker and Alex together. And I
Yeah.
love that you tell us about why you put that picture there and the source of that picture, because it just humanizes these two men.
Yeah, well, they're fun loving guys, and I don't know where that photo was taken, but Parker has this gigantic sombrero on. Um, but I also in my little essay I have some photos from their wedding last month, and just it was the wedding was a really great. In my feeling is that it was a great family uniting experience, and I don't know that I knew what the wedding was going to be like going into it. I was kind of unsure of what the feeling would be like there, and it ended up being a really great family experience with two families, and when they had lots of out-of-town guests that flew in, even with COVID, who flew in to be there, and they were married in the backyard of their home. It was a beautiful, beautiful ceremony, and there was just a good family feeling there, frankly.
Tell us why you officiated at that wedding.
Yeah, I did. It was so Parker and Alex came to me about 4 or 5 months before the wedding, and said, "Hey, Dad, would you consider officiating at the wedding and marrying us?" And I said, "Wow, I'm honored that you would ask me, and I don't know much about that." But it wasn't hard to spend your $39 online and you become an ordained minister who is legally can legally perform wedding in Utah. The state of Utah recognizes that. And so I thought about that for a long time and discussed it with my wife, and I just felt like it was the right thing to do. And rather than having a friend of theirs or a justice of the peace or somebody perform that marriage, it felt to me like an opportunity to make the marriage, well, not that I could make the marriage anything, but it was an opportunity to invite a family feeling to the event, rather than this is about gay marriage, or this is a same-sex marriage or whatever. That it wasn't about that. It was about two great people being married, and it was a great family event. And our family and Alex's family are now joined together, and it was about family. And so I felt like that by participating in that way, it would be an opportunity for me to help invite that feeling to the event.
I love that. I love I just think those are the principles that we're taught in the church is family. Family is the most important unit of the church. Sorry, most important unit, family unit on the earth, and everything the church is doing is trying to increase the strength of families. And I love the process you went. I love that Parker and Alex asked you to perform the wedding. I think that's awesome. They asked you, and that they sensed that that was something you'd consider. And I love the fact you said this isn't about same-sex marriage. This is about family. And my role as a patriarch, that's one of the words you use in your blog, and in that role as a father and a patriarch to officiate in that wedding. And this is all about family and bringing two families together and supporting these two in the path that they feel is best for them.
Yeah, that's how I felt, and my wife and my children were supportive of that position. I appreciated that.
And I would hope that we don't, if an active LDS father or mother, legally you could perform a wedding as a woman the same way.
Sure.
Or a sibling. I hope that we don't, judge people that feel like that's the right thing to do in their family. I hope that one of the things I hope is we don't lose whole families over this. Parker, you could kind of update us where Parker is from a church standpoint, but why don't you first update us? Is Parker and Alex, are they trying to still attend church, or is that just not really a reality given that they're in a same-sex marriage?
It's probably not really a reality, I think, for them right now, and they they both were very active in the church up until about the time that they got engaged. And so what's nice about Alex and Parker is that they're not bitter.
Good.
They're not out bashing the church because of its policies or being negative in any way. I think they just kind of feel neutral right now. I think that they think that we love what we learned growing up as a church. We love the church, and I think they love God and have testimonies of the gospel of Jesus Christ absolutely in their hearts, and that's a strong part of who they are. But I think that they, like many LGBTQ people, are unsure what the path forward is now with the church. Is there a place for them in the church? And I submit that there really isn't right now. And so it's difficult to be kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. I talk in my essay about a couple of people that I've gotten to know that kind of participate. There's a gentleman I know who lives back east who's been married to his husband for many, many years, and they're fairly active in their ward. They're not, quote, members of, they're not official members, but they attend church and they attend the activities, and their bishop invites them to do genealogical work, and they do things in the ward or the stake extraction center or whatever. So is there a place? I don't know that there is a place, and I think Parker and Alex don't feel really like there's a place for them to be
It's
active.
a pretty honest answer.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that's an honest answer. And so sometimes we lose whole families because they feel judged by their LDS friends the way they're supporting their LGBTQ child. Have you felt any of that, or do you talk about that in your essay? Just perhaps you feel judged, or I've always felt we should give you an increased measure of support and love as you're doing the very best you can in a pretty complex situation. And the last thing we should do is cause you to feel judged that you're not doing this right.
I think I have not felt that, and
Good.
I have a great ward and a great neighborhood, and I live in Provo, Utah, so all my neighbors are also my ward members. And I haven't felt that at all, and I've been just so blessed to be around and live in a ward where people are really open and accepting. However, I do have some friends who are in similar situations that live other places in the country where it has been more difficult for them. And I think it's really tragic if like you just said, if we lose a family because their support has created a situation where they're not comfortable anymore being in their ward, or maybe they feel like there's some ill feelings about them being so supportive. And some of that, not to call out any particular general authorities' words, but there are, as we all know, there are a couple of general authorities that are really strong in their opinions about this issue. And there's been some things said that would make some members think that a family or parents who support an LGBTQ child ought to be on the road to repentance rather than to be supported. And that in making a choice between supporting the policies of the church or supporting their LGBTQ child, in making that choice, that they ought to be making the opposite choice and not supporting their child. There's been things said like that.
Agreed.
And so if that becomes sort of a standard and lots of members feel that way, then I could see that feeling being around a family. And wouldn't it be tragic if that caused a family to dismantle or abandon a lot of their faith traditions and all the things that come with being an active member of the church because of that kind of thinking? That would be tragic.
That's a good segment, and I just believe we need to extend families like yours, like your Provo community is doing, just an increased measure of love and support, versus any feeling of judging. And we have created some, members don't know what to do because our church has probably sent mixed messages on this subject. I agree with that. And so members kind of hold back, and that holding back often can have members feel like people are withdrawing from them, or they're not asking. I hope if I lived in your community, I would ask, and I knew your 5 kids and I grew up with you, I'd ask just as much about Parker as I would any of the other kids in your family, and I wouldn't stop talking about him. I'd ask, how's his marriage doing? Do they plan on having kids? What's his career? Just the same. To me, that's just a measure of respect. That's just what we do as human families. We're interested in other people and what they're doing. And I assume you'd be glad to talk to Parker about Parker to anybody that asked about Parker, because you're proud of him.
Yeah, we're very proud of him, and we're happy to talk about it. And I think what you just said is good advice for any of your listeners that are on this path.
Are there things I haven't asked, or part of your essay that you'd like to make sure our listeners are aware of?
There are 3 or 4 things that I mentioned in my essay that I think we can do as individuals, regardless of what the church does institutionally. And those recommendations are absolutely meant for LDS, active LDS people who are struggling with trying to figure out how to navigate this issue. And there are 3 or 4 recommendations that I a little bit sheepishly make to the church as an institution.
Good.
Even though
we don't usually do that.
We don't usually do that. So I'm not trying to be too directive. I feel like I can be more directive to other members than I can be to the church institutionally. However, I felt like they were different, and so I kind of categorized them in those 2 ways. And as far as individuals, we've talked about it already quite a bit, but I think the idea of just at this point not just putting aside that whole discussion one I talked about the origins of homosexuality, and just be pragmatic and just know that the best thing to do is to love and accept people, and let the Lord work out the rest of it. I think that's one of the things that from my essay that I hope people will take away individually.
Do you want to share any of those institutional suggestions?
One of them is I think that the church needs to be really careful in the way that they sometimes it feels to me like in 2012 when the church launched the website that's specific about LGBTQ or same-sex attraction, that was kind of the first time that the church kind of officially acknowledged that same-sex attraction is not a learned behavior, and that there's no sin in being LGBTQ. The sin is in acting out on being LGBTQ. And that, back in 2012, 8 years ago, is when they first kind of started to move down that road. But it's kind of, sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Recently, just a few weeks ago, and I write about this in my essay, there was an email sent out by the church to all its members, or at least a lot of members, because I have lots of friends who got the same email. And there were at least two versions of the email, depending on how old you are. So I got the version that the headline said, having the Savior help you overcome things. And in the copy, one of the things that it said was, if you are trying to overcome challenges like aging, and kind of, because I think I'm in my 60s, so I got that version. But I know a young person who got the version that said, if you're trying to overcome something like same-sex attraction. And I think what happens is we have to pick, as a church, we have to pick one side or the other. If we acknowledge that people, it's not learned behavior and there's no sin in being LGBTQ, then we have to stop saying institutionally that it's something we need to overcome. And that was the message of the email. If you need help overcoming this, then click here and watch this little video. But saying that it's something that needs to be overcome is very different than acknowledging that it is what it is, and our expectation is that you'll be celibate or into a heterosexual marriage anyway. Those are two different things. I know that's subtle, and maybe it sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but I feel like institutionally there's not enough thought given to these mixed messages, and what that does is it hurts young people and leads to despair and suicide and things that we just ought not to be accepting in this space. And so I think the church needs to do a better job of making sure that they're really clear in their communications, because it's such a delicate issue.
That's a really good example, Jack. I'm glad you pointed that one out, because to do better in that space doesn't require a change of doctrine. It's really kind of owning our current teachings that sexual orientation is not a choice. And so overcoming same-sex attraction, it puts the burden back on the person sort of overcome this or become straight. And I think that leads to incredible shame and self-loathing and hyper-religiosity and making deals with God. And then when you're still LGBTQ, it leads to feelings of lost hope. And that's the thing that no one wants to, we don't want anybody to lose hope. One of the chapters I've written in this book that I've written is the role of the atonement of Jesus Christ. And it's fascinating to hear LGBTQ people talk about the role of the atonement. It's an application of the role of atonement I've never considered, but it's largely about, instead of using the atonement to take this away from me, using the atonement to heal my broken heart and give me hope. So it's not to take away, it's to be able to live with, in a healthy way, this part of about them, and not look upon this part of about them as something that needs correcting or something that should be carved out of them if they could. Because it's like being left-handed and we're asking you to become right-handed.
Yes. And I like that you said that you can be clear about what the expectation is. If the expectation is what it is, then just be clear that that's the expectation. But the idea of overcoming and choosing a different path and getting back into the fold by changing your orientation just doesn't make sense anymore to talk about it that way.
Yeah, we'd never have the word, straight, help you overcome being straight.
Right.
So I think we need to put everybody on the same moral footing and invite everybody equally, put them on the same moral footing. Other examples that come to mind you'd like to share?
I should have brought my essay.
It's a great essay. And the goal of this podcast is partly to connect people to your essay. We're going to link to in the podcast. So if any of you can just scroll down your episode description and you can link directly to the essay. And I encourage people to read it, because Jack's just got a great heart and is trying to do the very best job he can, like many of us, to be a committed Latter-day Saint and be committed to his baptism covenants to mourn, bear, and comfort for LGBTQ people, and his role that as a father of a gay son, you have unique responsibility to know best in many ways for your son. I think that's part of the core teaching of our church, is that parents often receive personal revelation for their children that is just something that's part of their divine role as parents. And we should honor the feelings you have about your son Parker and about his path. We shouldn't judge you for having a feeling about the best path for Parker and sort of, say that you're not doing this right as a LDS parent.
Yeah, exactly. that reminded me of there is one
Good.
thing in my essay that some members of the church may think is a little bold, maybe too bold. I don't know, but I kind of make what I think is my case for being able to one day accept faithful, legally wed, same-sex couples in full fellowship without changing doctrine. And probably church members think, well, there's no way, that's impossible without changing doctrine. But going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about this covenant path idea, I don't think we have to change anything having to do with the doctrine of the covenant path and what leads to what we believe is exaltation and eternal life with our families. There's nothing about that doctrine that needs to change in order for us to realize that it's an eternal path, and perhaps not everybody will enjoy the same covenant opportunities in this life. So, while again, it may seem like heresy in some people's minds, I really believe that there is a path forward if the Lord ever chooses to inspire our leaders to make that change. I think that change could actually come without compromising doctrine. And I know that's kind of maybe too bold, but I try to explain why I feel that way in my essay.
And you do it so kindly, and you do it in your essay so kindly. I think it's appropriate to talk about possible ways forward. I think it's back to chapter 40. I think most Latter-day Saints, and I think our leaders would probably say the restoration is an ongoing process. It feels like there's more work to do in this space. And I think it's okay for people in a way that, yeah, I'm still supporting our leaders. It's their responsibility to make this decision. I don't know God's will. But here are some ideas, I think, on how a path forward as I continue to support the current path. I think to me that's a faithful position as a Latter-day Saint. And we need to keep, if it's back to the purity test,
Yeah.
if you being open with some of your thoughts about a path forward in our church, we don't want to lose you, Jack, because we're worse off if we lost you and your wife and your whole family because you have some feelings about a path forward. So that's kind of a hope that we just create more space for all of us. To me, one heart and one mind, that scripture in Moses doesn't mean we have all the same uniform feelings. We just all want to help people come into Christ through our church. That is the core reason we're here on earth, is to come into Christ. And our church is a means to do that. And but we all may have a little bit different feelings on the best way to do that. And we may have unique roles in helping individual people come into Christ that are unique to our personal gifts and personal ministry. And so I think we shouldn't be triggered when we hear someone that maybe suggests that things could change down the road. I think it's okay to look in the rearview mirror and recognize that things have changed historically. And that seems to be part of the ongoing restoration.
Yeah. And the Savior had a lot of ideas that were kind of counterintuitive in his day, didn't he? Like,
he did.
He's the one who said that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. He's the one that said we should leave the 99 and go find the one who has strayed. I mean, a lot of the things that he taught were certainly counterintuitive to the leaders of the church at that time. And so I'm not trying to draw a parallel between current church leadership and the Pharisees and Sadducees of Christ's day. I'm not trying to draw that comparison. I'm simply saying that being open to ideas that may at first seem counterintuitive may in fact not be as counterintuitive once they've been explored more and talked about more, and the Spirit has had an opportunity to to soften people's hearts and to have people look at things in a different way.
Thank you, Jack. I think that's a good, just an ending comment. So well done. I'll just say a couple more remarks, and if you have anything else you want to say, but I really want, people to go to jackhadley.com. We'll link in the podcast copy and read this essay. It's very, very thoughtful. And you've just spent over a year, I believe, pouring your heart into these thoughts. And I think lots of LDS parents of LGBTQ are doing the same thing, because there's not sort of a roadmap. There's not a lesson manual that says, okay, this is how you do it. You've got LGBTQ children. And so I think you've had to rely on personal revelation, a lot of meditation and prayer. And I think sharing what you've learned in your family experience helps others. And so thanks just for what you're doing. I'm glad you officiated the wedding. I love your perspective. I did this because of my role to keep our family circled together. And the message that sends about the importance of family for the Hadley family. And I'm just thinking of your future grandchildren, your children, and the principles that you directly teach. When you do that, that the family is number one, and we're going to do everything we can to keep the family circled together. And we're going to just leave everything else at the Savior's feet. I think that's relieving for LDS parents. And so thank you for being on the podcast. Any final comments, Jack?
No, but thank you, Richard, for inviting me. My wife and I have have received a lot of strength just by listening to you over this last year. Before we got started here, you asked how I had heard about the podcast, and I mentioned that my wife first saw something about it on social media. And so she was doing the dishes one day and had one of your episodes going on the iPad, and I walked through the room and I said, "What are you listening to?" And we listened to one of your episodes. This was about a year ago, and since then, that's been a great source of strength for us, just to hear the way that you to talk about these issues, and just your kind and gentle way of being fair and having these discussions. So I was honored that you had asked me to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm glad you and your wife have listened. And it's really the guests that are like you that are the real heroes of this podcast, to bravely share what they're learning about this space, or if they're in this space, if they're LGBT, to share their own lived experiences. And thank you, our listeners, for all you're doing to make the podcast work and share it with others. And this is Richard Osler and my friend Jack Hadley signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.